Good afternoon to all of you. You'll be able to join me as the sun slowly rises here in Washington, D.C. I'm sorry I couldn't join you this morning in person, but I'm really excited to be able to talk about our topic this morning. And as Chris mentioned, we're going to be breaking this up into with lots of times for questions. So first, just want to make sure folks can see the slides. Someone give me a thumbs up. Great. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to spend the next few days talking about a lot of issues in IoT security. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time diving into some of the known vulnerabilities. There are going to be some better experts who can talk about that. Instead, I'm going to start today by just talking about this guy, Shlomi. Now, I've had a chance to talk with Shlomi over the past few months, and we were both kind of sad that neither of us got to go to Las Vegas this year for Black Hat and DEF CON. Now, I would have gone and given a couple talks, had a lot of great meetings, had a lot of fun as we do every year, but Shlomi would have given a very popular talk, and in fact, he did give one at the virtual DEF CON. And maybe you're not someone who just can automatically look at a vulnerability number and know exactly what it is, so you may know that Shlomi and his team discovered the Ripple 20 vulnerability. Now, again, I don't want to get too deep into the nature of this, but the Ripple 20 vulnerability is really interesting because it was a set of vulnerabilities in a TCP/IP library that is buried deep in a bunch of different operating systems, which in turn are used in connected devices, which are used literally everywhere. So how did they figure out which devices to use? Because a lot of us have done work with saying, well, once you find a vulnerability, you have to tell people about it. You have to tell the manufacturers, ideally, in a responsible or in a coordinated fashion. So some of it was straightforward. So they had to find it in lots of devices because they knew it was out there everywhere. Some of it was straightforward, where they had in their lab an uninterruptible power supply. They could test it, and they said, we know that this is using this core library called TREC, and let's sort of demonstrate that we can actually build an exploit and attack this uninterruptible power supply, right? The thing that's supposed to be secure, that's supposed to not fail, they should have could fail. But they wanted to find it across the entire ecosystem. And one of the ways that they had to do this is they had to actually go on LinkedIn and say, who is talked about having experience in this TREC IP stack? Because that's how little visibility we have into the supply chain for connected devices, is we have no idea who is using what underlying component for software. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is the building blocks that make up software. So when you're giving a virtual presentation, you not only have to be more interesting than everything else in the room, I literally have to be more interesting than anything else on the internet this morning. So what we're going to talk about today is, first, I'm going to talk about the general case for transparency and how transparency is really beneficial for markets. And we're going to talk explicitly about how transparency for IoT softwares can be useful. We'll pause for some questions. We'll talk a little bit about how we get there. This is sort of for my fellow government folks. This is going to be the process discussion, where we say, why don't we already have this? Because it's important to know why we don't have something if we want to change the world. And then I'm going to talk about how we are actually trying to change the world in this open, multi-stakeholder, international, kumbaya style. Then we're going to sort of dive in and say, well, what is an SBOM? And then finally, we're going to talk about how we're making SBOM a reality today, and ideally convince some of you to join in and help. Whether you build things, whether you're a researcher, whether you're with a government agency, there's room for a lot of us to participate. So, transparency. A lot of us understand the idea of a list of ingredients, where, you just go to the store, you say, hey, this is what I want, and this is what I'm worried about. Now, this is the list of ingredients for Twinkies, and maybe you enjoy this particular non-biodegradable snack, and that's great, but maybe you want to look at the list of ingredients anyway. So turns out Twinkies not vegetarian. Now, many of us may not care, and that's okay, because all of us know someone who has a dietary restriction or a food sensitivity. And the goal here is we use this list of ingredients to empower those individuals to make the risk-based decision. to figure out what works for them in their own right context. So why don't we take the same expectations for the software that's all over our homes, that's running our critical infrastructure, that's literally embedded in our bodies? Why don't we expect the very same transparency that we would get from a Twinkie? Now, there are some other analogies. This isn't just a food metaphor. There are other industries where we have this kind of approach. So there's an international standard, an ISO standard for material data safety sheet, where if you run a factory, you get a bunch of large containers of chemicals. Each of them comes with a thing that says, hey, this is what you do if this thing spills all over Steve's feet. And now we know how to clean up after this. This is the basic transparency we have. In fact, there's a term, a bill of materials. No one is building any of these fancy devices that we're talking about today without first listing, here are all the widgets and sprockets that we need to build this device. So we have the idea of a software bill of materials, which is just a record that says, not only that says, here are the pieces of software that are going into this. Right? Software is not hewn out of marble by tonsured monks on Greek islands. It is built out of components, many of them open source, but not all. And an SBOM is the nested inventory that says, here are the relationships, here's how we move them forward. So I often talk about SBOM by focusing on just the vulnerabilities and how to react. And in fact, I think this is a really important point. When we discover a new vulnerability, like one of the ones with the fancy logos on this slide, we have this question of saying, am I affected? And to me, it's really strange that the hard part is not discovering the vulnerability, right? That should be the hard part. It's for security researchers to figure out what the flaws are. But today, very few organizations, once a vulnerability is known, can quickly and easily answer, am I affected? And that should be an easy thing. But SBOM isn't just about vulnerabilities. It really helps cover the entire software ecosystem. And we've already talked about the importance of having a secure development process, or an SDLC. Very hard to claim that you have a good development process if you're not tracking what you're actually developing with. Similarly, if you're concerned about the supply chain, we need to make sure that what we're using is good. Risk management as we get towards the consumer side of things. If I'm about to buy a bunch of smart TVs, well, you and I may care if our smart TV is spying on us. But you know who should really care? Is the CISO for a major hotel chain, right? They need to have some tools to say what's going into these things that we're putting in our organizations. And of course, vulnerability management. Are there vulnerabilities out there? Now, this isn't just traditional software. This is something that we talk a lot about in traditional software, but I'd argue that SBOMs are even more useful once we're talking about IoT and OT and just embedded devices. So for example, this is a 2013 Mercedes S-Class, a very nice car, probably nicer than what I could afford on a government salary, but it's got some interesting things. As we all know, modern cars built completely on software. I'm certainly not singling out any one automaker here. Couple of years ago, the famous hacker and the founder of the cyber independent testing lab, Mudge, tweeted out that if you have this Mercedes S-Class, you have libtiff, netcat, libpcap all pre-installed. Now, for those of you who think about software intrusion, libtiff is a very vulnerable library. Netcat is a great way to move across networks, and libpcap is a great way to exploit Nextel. So the punchline that Mudge set me up is if you bought this car brand new, it came pre-owned. It was exploitable from the get-go. And I think that's very important to know. The other thing that's useful to know is, how did Mudge know this? He didn't have an SBOM. But we're already thinking about transparency for software licenses. And I'll come back to licensing a little later. So, cars and planes, right? This is a delightful plane. And you say, well, hey, does this thing have vulnerabilities? Surely it may not. But 2 years ago, there was a bunch of vulnerabilities found in named the Urgent 11 vulnerabilities. They were initially thought to be just in a single real-time operating system called VxWorks. Turns out that they were actually vulnerabilities in an ingredient that VxWorks used, their TCP/IP library, that was built in the late 90s and has been used in a whole bunch of different real-time operating systems. Those in turn, one of them, Green Hills, is used by Airbus through a third-party software provider that contracted to Airbus. So this stuff is everywhere. And if we don't have a clean visibility in the supply chain, it's very hard to determine where these risks may be, even when they're in some of our most important systems. So you say, Alan, that's okay. Critical infrastructure is important. I'm just interested in the consumer side of things. Well, we have another problem there, which is it's not clear who makes what. This is a great project by a woman at NTT Labs in Japan, where she said the problem is we white box so much stuff, but under the hood, it may be the same thing. So how do we track vulnerabilities? The way we currently think about vulnerabilities is with national vulnerability databases and CVEs, and that's all well and good if you're using a Fortune 100 brand. But the things we're worried about are going to be not from any one manufacturer. They're going to be in open source code. They're going to be in commercial packages that are reused and reused everywhere without visibility. SBOM is the idea that we have some visibility. So when I talk about SBOM, who am I talking about? Because a lot of IoT, we focus on consumer empowerment. I don't really think this is a role for my 76-year-old father. He's super smart, but this isn't something I expect him to do. I'm really focusing on organizations here, both the folks who produce software and those who manage and maintain software. An organization simply can't defend what it doesn't know about. And we know this, right? The basic approach that we have from the NIST cybersecurity framework or any approach is the first thing if you're defending your network is you need to know what you have. And that's great. So if we can't do asset management, if that's something that your organization does not currently have the ability to say, what are the assets on my network? That's wonderful. I would certainly never encourage anyone to leave this amazing conference, but that really should be your priority before we worry about reforming the entire IoT network. Let's start with this asset management. Once we have that, I argue that the next evolution in security is it's time to look under the hood and say, not only what are the assets I have, but what are their components? And to that, we have SBOM. I'm going to talk a lot about the roles and benefits, but really, again, there are three mentalities to think about. There are people who produce software, there are people who make the decision about how to buy the software, and the people who are operating the software. And of course, that applies for the devices as well. So I'm going to pause here. Chris may let me know that there are some questions already.
Over to me. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Alan. Going from Twinkies to airplanes in 10 minutes, that's pretty fast. There's actually no questions on the chat. So I think if you build a case for SBOM, you did it. So let's go.
I'm really glad to hear that everyone's on board.
Yes, yes. So please continue with part 2. And if if you want to use the chat, please do.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And my contact information will be available for the community. If anyone wants to follow up, either for their organization or personally, really my focus is to promote this idea because as you're going to see in this next segment, this really is a global community that we built together around this vision. So hopefully by now, I've convinced you that this level of transparency is going to be very important. And so the very obvious question is, Alan, if this is such a great idea, why aren't we doing this already? So the first thing to acknowledge is some folks tried. Over 5 years ago, there was a bill in the United States Congress that would have required everything that the Defense Department bought. For those of you who don't know, the Defense Department buys a lot of things. So to have a software bill of materials, everything had to come with a software bill of materials. To put it mildly, the IT industry nuked this from orbit. It was terminated with extreme prejudice to the point that when I first started this initiative and started talking about it in Washington, D.C. over 3 years ago, I avoided using the term SBOM because the term was still radioactive in the lobbyist class. Now, so I came up with the term software component transparency, because how could you be against transparency, right? Everyone loves transparency. But I think it's important to acknowledge why there was so much objection. And some of it, I think, was for venal reasons. It was around things like software licensing. So some of you are familiar with different types of licenses, including the GPL, which comes from the Free Software Foundation. And I'm not sure until very recently how many of even the biggest companies in the world could honestly say they had all of their software licenses in order. Today, I'd argue that's a much better understood risk. If you're a startup, you know that you're going to go through an open source audit. There are tools out there, there are commercial off-the-shelf tools that can scan for potential license violations. There are things like the Linux Foundation Open Chain, which helps companies train to manage their licenses. This is something that corporate officers understand. It's a much better understood risk today. The other thing we should acknowledge is that it's hard. And I'll talk about some of the challenges we're working for. But I think it makes sense to say we shouldn't put something, pardon me, in regulation that we don't actually know how to do. And in fact, that's been a big part of our focus here, is to say, let's address these problems as a community. Let's understand what it looks like. And that way, folks can start doing it. And then we acknowledge governments are going to government. And I'll talk a little more about that later. So one real question that we have in terms of why this hasn't happened is it was a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, where no one was asking for it, so no one was providing it, and no one was providing it, so no one was asking for it. So that is what those of us who have some economics training think of as a market failure. And of course, we're going to talk about other market failures in security, especially with my old friend Michel Van Eaton later in this program. But one of the lovely things about market failures is, first, they have fun math for those of us who like the economics of it. But it's also a great chance for us in the government to get involved. And now, traditionally, how does the government solve problems? Well, we have the carrot or the stick. Now, I'm from the US Department of Commerce. I'm from a small part of it called NTIA. You know, that part of the government is not empowered by Congress to tell anyone to do anything, right? We don't have that regulatory authority. So I can't change things by fiat. That requires Congress. And even worse, no one gave me a very large checkbook. So I don't have the money to start paying people to do things. And so the solution we have is actually something that I discovered several years ago is quite familiar from the Dutch approach of sort of what is traditionally, I believe, referred to as the polder model. We call it the multi-stakeholder process. And some of you who've been involved in things like ICANN and internet governance are familiar with this idea. So this is your dreaded process slide for those of you who deal with government folks. And really what we've tried to do is build this open, transparent, consensus-based process for folks around the world. And we've cast a very large scope. So first, the key priority was this had to be cross-sector. And that's one of the reasons why it's in the Department of Commerce as opposed to a sector-specific agency, like the folks who regulate energy or healthcare or things like that. Because the one thing we didn't want is to say, this is the solution for 5G networks, and here's a different solution for medical devices, and here's a third solution for power generation, because we all use the same software. So any solutions we have needs to work across the sectors. Now, we can tailor the solutions to your specific needs. That's fine, and we're working on that. But the goal, the foundational goal is it has to be cross-sector. It also has to cover the entire supply chain. We wanted to make sure, right, this isn't something that is just an open source problem. It's not just a commercial problem. It also has to cover the embedded software side of things. And perhaps most importantly, the end customer. And again, I'm talking about the enterprise customer or the organization rather than you know, the individual customer. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So we really want the entire scope because we're focusing on the entire supply chain. And so we don't want just transparency for its own sake. We want to make sure the data is usable. Now, this is a very broad scope. And so as a result, we've tried to emphasize just tackling the challenge of software dependencies, or the SBOM. There are lots of other things we want to do, and we can talk all about how this can slot into other initiatives. And in fact, I hope one of the outcomes of this process that you have, this great project you've launched, is to better understand how SBOM can map into and dock and marry with all of the other great initiatives you're talking about. It's also important to acknowledge what we're not doing. And again, we're not building regulation. This is very much not an American government specific initiative. It's not even an American industry initiative. I'm really pleased that we've got a number of Dutch companies involved. We've got more European companies involved. We're partnering with some certs around Europe, around the world. We're partnering closely with Japanese cert and Japanese companies. I went to Japan twice last year. You remember travel? So this is really a global effort. It's not source code disclosure. For those of you who are worried about that, that's often a policy concern. This is also not a formal standards development process. I'm going to talk about standards a little later on. And perhaps most importantly, as I mentioned, this is not about solving all security issues. It's not trying to solve every supply chain issue, not trying to solve every assurance issue. We're just focused on this one issue. But I think you'll agree with me that if we have this in the ecosystem, we can build on it, and it will really reinforce a lot of these different areas that I've talked about, such as secure development, supply chain, risk management, and vulnerability management. Over the last few years, we've been at this for 2 years, and I think we've made a lot of progress. Remember, when I first started, this was a very controversial issue. And I also want to be clear, I didn't invent this idea. It had been kicking around for a while. Remember, there was some failed legislation. But one of the great things the community did was they pulled together and they said, here's the shared vision of the problem. We have a common vision of what we're trying to do. We're focusing on a baseline SBOM. The mantra of the community has been crawl, walk, run. We're not trying to get ahead of ourselves. We're not trying to build some magical golden standard that will solve the entire thing forever. Those of you who come in the standards world know that if you try to build a standard that solves everything, it will be lovely, but no one will ever use it. So we're emphasizing scalability, modularity, and machine readability, right? If this is happening by hand, we're doing it wrong. So it needs to be machine readable, it needs to be scalable, and it needs to be modular. Again, making sure this can fit in with your other solutions that you like. There's some resources, and I'll plug this URL again if anyone's curious, ntia.gov/SBOM. For those of you who are in the government, I'm really proud of how short that URL is. That took a lot of work to get. So there's been some great work over the course of 2019. The community established sort of the what, the why, and the how. And now our current focus is on deployment and getting SBOMs into the real world. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's some questions, and otherwise we'll just plow right on.
Well, Allan, we actually have a whole host of questions, so apparently
Excellent.
people just needed to get warmed up. So I don't know if we can answer them all, but let me just briefly mention the first 3 questions, which immediately came after part 1. So the first one was, how could this be incorporated into Agile? Well, I don't know, get a lawyer on your Scrum team. SBOM is good, but what about the interfaces? And the third one, I think you already touched upon it slightly. How do you see SBOM working with closed source resources? So any of these 3 very first questions you want to ask?
Those are great questions. So in terms of the Agile process, both for Agile and for DevOps, I think SBOM naturally fits in to your own development process. And of course, no process is going to be distinct, but essentially tracking what you have is going to be key. And in fact, if you have a modern development process, this should be fairly straightforward. If you're implementing things like allow lists or deny lists, you're already doing some of this. And a lot of the modern build capabilities have this. I'm going to talk about a standard called Cyclone DX, which comes out of the OWASP world, which is ready for this. So there are some tools there. On the interfaces side, I'll get into the standard side in just a little bit. And on the last question, sorry, Chris, remind me of the last question, and I can dive into that.
How do you see SBOM working with closed source resources?
So that's a great question, and we think that's going to be a big part of this. And in fact, you know, the examples that I've mentioned early on are closed source, right? A lot of the vulnerabilities that we're thinking about, such as the Urgent 11 and the Ripple 20 and things like that, are going to be in closed source software. And that's okay, because we're not requiring anyone to disclose their source. They just have to say, what they're using. And again, let's go back to that list of ingredients analogy. You don't have to give anyone the recipe for what you do, but you do have to tell them if there's an allergen inside it. And so I'm going to walk through the what and the why, and I'm going to make it clear that part of this is building in the freedom for organizations to say, I'm not going to tell you what's in it. And that's okay, but we're going to make it explicit that you have to tell your customers or your downstream partners that you're not telling them what's in it. So, Allan, you've been talking about SBOM for a while, and you gave a definition, but I'd like to see what's the focus of what we're actually talking about. So, I'm going to walk through some slides now that help us understand what an SBOM is. So, here's a toy example. We have our Acme appliance. Acme appliance contains exactly 2 immediate dependencies. It's got Bingo Buffer and it's got Bob's Browser. Now, Bob's Browser, in turn, includes a component called Carol's compression engine. So that's really all this is we're just trying to say for each piece of software on my network, and again, Acme appliance may in turn be used in another system, and so we would go according to that. But to the point I was making about known unknowns, this is one of the key parts of this, because we're not going to have complete information as we start this. And so in this case, we know for certain that Acme appliance has exactly 2 dependencies. We have no idea what's in Bingo Buffer. It may have a lot of dependencies, it may have none. We know that Carol's compression engine has no further dependencies, right? We know that it is either a leaf or a root, depending on how you talk about your trees. And of course, Bob's Browser is partial. So in this case, we know that it contains at least Carol's compression engine. We don't know if it contains more. So this is the core of what we're trying to do in SBOM, is to just make this dependency graph, the directed acyclic graph, for those of you who are in the computer science world, part of how we talk about things, and making sure that we have some idea of what information is available and what isn't. Now, for each of those components that I talked about, we don't need that much information. You know, when I go and talk to folks who are in high assurance world, right? They're in sensitive parts of government or something like that. They say, I want all the information about every piece of software, and that's wonderful. But I'm focused on what's achievable today. And today, I think this is very achievable. Just, hey, this piece of software, what's the supplier? You know, what corner of the open source world or what corner of the commercial world did it come from? What's the component name? What's the version, so that I know if it's vulnerable or not? And then what's the hash, so that I can be confident that you and I are talking about the same piece of software, and that you know that I didn't pull this down from a, sorry about the large light that's coming in as the sun rises here. So that you and I both know that we didn't that I didn't pull this down from a backdoor GitHub library, that we're talking about the same trustworthy piece of software. So next question, how many levels deep, right? I've already touched on this a little bit, right? Software isn't just a bunch of top level includes. Software uses software, uses software, uses software. I've talked to someone who once told me, you know, I want to know what's in my device all the way down to the sand and the silicon. And again, that's a lovely vision, and maybe someday we'll get there, but I think we need to sort of understand what's realistic. So the way the community has defined it is they have said, we're not going to specify a minimum depth for everything, right? You must include all the top level includes. A lot of the use cases, however, are about things that are buried deeper into the software, and I'll talk about that more later on. So you should ask for all of those SBOMs in turn. And in fact, if you're writing a contract or you're building some regulation, you can specify whatever you want. This is just the voluntary guidelines the community has come up with. Ideally, we'll be able to make a best effort for all known components. And that will do 2 things. One, that gets us the power of recursion, especially as we get into open source, or we can use tools like software composition analysis and binary analysis to get some better ideas of what's in these devices. And it also helps us say, well, let's at least try to get to the open source world. And once we're in the open source world, then it's a lot easier to get this kind of information, especially with some of the great work that's already happening in the open source community. So that's really what an SBOM is it's just, here are the dependencies, here's the basic information about them, here's the limit of what I know and what I don't know. So I've talked a little bit about why we should do this, but I want to drill into a few more key points. I showed this slide before, but I want to walk through just a little more closely, which is that SBOM doesn't magically solve anyone's problem completely. It's one of these cases where the benefits are going to accrue to a number of different folks, but it is going to help folks across the board. So for example, if you make devices, think about how this can actually save you money, right? I talked to the director of product security of a very large international company that has a strong play in the energy sector. And this director said, if we had an SBOM for all of our products today, it could save us tens of thousands of man hours. Tens of thousands. That is real differences in your spreadsheets. Why? Because every time a new vulnerability comes out, the product security team has to go through and figure out whether or not they're affected. And that's a lot of work to do without having an SBOM. An SBOM allows you to target, here's the analysis and what I want to do. It also gives you a lot better long-term strategy, right? You can start thinking about end of life. So for example, I'm using a library that is going to discontinue support for single-threaded processors. Well, if your product depends on single-threaded processors, you need to know that well in advance. It allows better things like agile development and DevOps for allow lists and deny lists and things like that. And it also gives you transparency for your customers. So for example, a corner of the Bank of America, not the entire organization, but a large chunk of it. And Bank of America is one of the largest banks in the United States. It's already asking for an SBOM, and they've been doing this for over 5 years under the guidance of a brilliant guy named Sunil Yu. And why are they asking for this? They're not asking for it in a specific data standard or format, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. In fact, I'd posit that you could probably send them the SBOM by fax machine. They're using this as a key signal. If you can't give them an SBOM, that tells Sunil and his team about the quality of your development process. And it means that your software probably is going to be more expensive for his team to have to maintain over the lifetime of their software. And that means, and they're doing this today, they're asking 5 to 10% off your asking price off the top before you can start negotiation, because they know that it's going to increase their total cost of ownership. Again, that's real dollars and cents here. This isn't just about security and good public policy. This is about making things more efficient. Similarly, if you choose software, right? If you buy things or if you're adopting open source software, SBOM is huge, right? Am I about to put something that is vulnerable out of the box on my network? It's going to be key. It helps you think about compliance policies. It shows best practices by the supplier, and of course, helps you think about licensing. And again, coming back to a role that almost all of us live in as organizations, which is we operate software. Can I find the vulnerability when I have it? The other thing is it's going to help us think about independent mitigations. So here's a sanitized case study on remediation of vulnerabilities. On the top is with SBOM, without an SBOM, on the bottom is with an SBOM. Now, SBOMs, as I keep implying, I don't want to say this, won't solve all of our problems. But, right, so for example, it won't magically create patches, but it does help us do other things. So on the top, we discover a vulnerability in a small part of our device, right, in a small open source component. Well, time T0 in January, we discover it, takes a long time to develop the patch. They send the patch downstream to the compound part manufacturer. Compound part manufacturer has to sort of figure it out, develop the patch. They send it down to the final good assembler. You know, this is the person who's building and shipping the device. They send it, and now it goes to the operator, whether it's a hospital, a power company, hotel, whatever. On the bottom, we have the world with an SBOM, which is all of us find out about the vulnerability January 1st or whenever we discover it. Now, it doesn't speed up the actual work that takes to make the patch and test the patch, but it does allow everyone downstream to think about other mitigations. So if you're that final customer, you're that nuclear power plant, you're that hospital, you can say, while I'm waiting for a patch, or, and I'll get to more on this later, figuring out whether or not it's even putting me at real danger, I can still take other mitigations. I can segment my network. I can tune my intrusion detection system, although we found out those don't work. I can tell my threat intelligence team to keep an eye out for, and let me know the second that there's an exploit in the wild. So then I can, yank things offline. There are other things that we can do to have this approach. The other value here is I think we're going to be able to use SBOM as a way of pushing quality into the software ecosystem, right? This is a chance for Darwin to become part of the 21st century. If I know what open source components or what commercial components are in my network, then I can have, I can start asking questions. I can say, hey, why are you using this particular component? There's a famous XKCD cartoon that some of you have seen, which I love, which is, right, the modern software ecosystem is all built on, one library that is dependent on one guy in the middle of Iowa, or, one woman in the middle of rural France. And, we want to make sure that we know what we have in our networks for resiliency. So we've got the what, we've got the why. None of this matters if we can't actually do this. And as I mentioned, we didn't want to create a brand new standard. There's another famous XKCD where we don't want a lot of standards. If you create a new standard, if there are too many standards, you create a new standard, now you've got even more standards. The other reason is, of course, standards take a lot more time. And we knew that there was going to be someone out there who already had a data format that could convey SBOM. And the good news was there was at least one community that came forward and says, we have a data format that, while it wasn't built for SBOM, can be used for SBOM. The bad news is that more than one community came forward and said, we have an SBOM format. And in fact, there are 3 formats right now that can implement SBOM data. So SPDX comes out of the Linux Foundation and has a reasonably wide deployed base. They've been thinking about this for a while. It was originally used to handle license management, right? To be able to track licenses across the open source ecosystem through metadata. But because its focus was, here's a piece of software, here's how it relates to another piece of software, we can use it for SBOM. And in fact, the community has embraced it and is reorganizing. They're currently on version 2.2. And as they plan for 3.0, they're reorganizing to make it even more explicitly focused on SBOM. SWID tags have the benefit of being an ISO standard. They also come out of the licensing world for commercial software licensing. This is something that my Commerce Department colleagues at NIST like a lot. There isn't quite as large an active development base and a community around this because it's not technically part of the open source world, but it is something that can be used for this because, again, a SWID tag is all about saying, here's a piece of software, here's its properties, here's how it relates to other things. And again, my colleagues at NIST are going to be doing more for this as well. And then the newest standard here is something that really just came out in the last few years called Cyclone DX, which comes out of the OWASP community with a real emphasis on modern application development and docking into that. But it's also very popular with some of the embedded device manufacturers and consultants that I talk to a lot, including the medical device folks. So our vision wasn't to say this should be the winner, right? That's not the government's job, is to pick a winner or a loser in a standards discussion. Instead, we wanted to focus on radical ecumenicism. We wanted to make sure that we could easily translate between the two of them and build out guidance to support all 3 formats that we're talking about. And in fact, here are the core SBOM fields that I talked about, which is, again, just trying to do this in a very basic fashion. Here's the supplier, the component, some unique identifier, the version, a hash, the relationship, and also the author, which is, where did this SBOM data come from? Did it come from the supplier? Did it come from further upstream? Did it come from a third-party source composition analysis expert? Right? We want to make sure that we have some sort of way of tracking the source of this data. And that's really the value here, is making sure that we can do this. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're tracking the ongoing tools that we have in the approach and what our next work is. But before then, I'll pause to see if there are any questions or comments on sort of the what, the why, and the how. And you can read all about this at ntia.gov/SBOM.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Well, yeah, we do have a lot of questions, comments, and one is actually giving a sort of presentation of himself because his first question was 25 minutes ago. You immediately switched to the next part. So, Roland van Rijswijk, well, thank you very much. What is the horizon of an SBOM? In other words, does it talk about libraries and executables used in a product, or does it also include things like programming languages, used specific compilers with potential bugs and file formats? And don't leave yet, because he later on elaborates on this question, which was 10 minutes ago, to clarify my earlier question, which relates to how many levels deep, because then you had the slide how many levels deep. Does the SBOM include the tools used in the manufacturing process, if you will, that involves compilers, linkers, etc.? And where I said does, you should read it out. Okay. Then he continues, thinking of an SBOM in the context of IoT, if the software is, and then somebody else types, baked in the device, does it ultimately mean it should be scrapped upon vulnerability? And this is the last comment. Repeating the question, thinking of an SBOM in the context of IoT. If the software is baked in to the device, does it ultimately mean it should be scraped upon vulnerabilities? Is an SBOM the precursor to required updatability? Well, it's a very long monologue, but sure. Now you can answer it, Alan.
No, those are great, great questions. Working backwards, the initiative that I ran at the Department of Commerce before SBOM actually focused explicitly on software updatability. And there's some great documents that are published. Happy to share those with anyone who's curious, where they really tried to define, when we say something's updatable, what do we mean? Both technically and from a policy perspective. Provides the community drafted some great guidance. So updatability is very key, and in fact, I'm very happy to see most of the guidance emphasizing updatability. We'll talk a little bit about the actual risks of a vulnerability, and I hope that some of your other speakers will over the next 2 days, because I think a lot of it is going to be context dependent, and there are also other mitigations, right? Software vulnerabilities shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of security. So for example, if you have a MUD compliant router, if you have a router that is smart enough to realize that your toaster shouldn't be talking to a random political website in Brazil, your home network can actually just say, hey, even if this is vulnerable, we're going to put on allow-less and deny-less at the network level to block this. So there are other areas where we can sort of think about this. Vulnerabilities are important, but they're not the total solution. In terms of what we're including, there are a lot of other things that we're going to want to know about an IoT device, right? Some of it's hardware-based, right? Am I using known compromised chips or things like that? That's a whole, hardware is a whole nother section. Similarly, there are details like compilers that are important. Part of what we're trying to do for scope and scalability is to say, this is important, but we're not going to focus on that today. And one of the reasons we're not going to do that is because there aren't really these easy global ways of processing that data today, right? We don't have, today, if you talk about a software component, you can map that to known vulnerability databases. You can map that to threat intelligence and things like that. The Cyber Independent Testing Lab, which is run by Sarah Zadka and was put together by Mudge, who I mentioned earlier, has done some great work looking at devices and compiler flags, pointing out that, in fact, the vast majority of home routers that are sold today don't have basic memory protection that'd be set at the compiler level. That's important data, but again, not part of SBOM. So, another quick question, and then we can move on.
Well, quick question. We have actually quite a lot of questions. So if you make the answers a little bit more brief, we have more
Sure.
questions.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, this is from CJ. Somebody wants to remain anonymous, and he says, or she says, in the era of America first, would it not be smarter for Europe to do this alone? That will then isolate US/Europe from both the evil five, interventionist US government, America first invention, as well as immunizing ourselves to the Chinese dragon. Well, that's very obvious. And somebody else already responds to CJ saying, well, there are initiatives in the EU already. I'm involved in one of the Netherlands and taking the concept forward. Well, actually, your SBOM has a global reach. Should it be, a global bill, or yeah, should we cut it up in continents? I guess I know what your answer is, Allan.
So you know, I'm a failed cryptographer and a failed economist, but I'm certainly not qualified to talk about the international politics of it. But what I can say is that we're all using the same software, and anyone who tries to say, especially in the open source community, that this chunk of software is somehow my country's, is going to have a bad time of it. I think there's a lot of work that countries can do to give themselves the confidence they want in terms of data protection and protecting their citizens' rights. And a lot of that starts with transparency. And that's a big part of why we've tried to build this movement of transparency as a global initiative.
Okay. Yeah, the response to the question was from Bart van Riel. He also has a comment. You don't need to answer it, but hi, Allan. Would you go into current ideas on SBOM content and data formats? I see coming that SBOM for enhancing security, automation is needed, and computers are not very good at interpretation. They need consistent data. You'd like to comment on that?
I will, and in fact, that covers, that helps me sort of pivot into what we're doing now. So I'm going to dive into that. We're going to try to walk through the next steps very quickly, and then we'll have a little more time for some more questions. And of course, we'll have my contact information. So what now? One of the things that we've emphasized as we've gone along is that this isn't just about talking. This isn't just about a paper exercise. You know, to coin a completely original phrase that we made up, rough consensus and running code. It's got to be something valuable. Now, one of the things we're very happy with is the work that's come out of the healthcare space. And we don't always think of the healthcare sector as leading in security, but there's been incredible progress over the last 2 years to sort of demonstrate what's possible. So over the course of 2019, a handful of medical device manufacturers, including some European companies like Philips and Siemens, partnered with some of the best hospitals in America to show that the device manufacturers could generate SBOMs and the hospitals could use them against predefined use cases. So think about asset management, vulnerability management, pre-purchase risk decision-making, things like that. And the good news was they were able to do it. The bad news was because they were doing this in parallel to all the work that I just talked about, no one was able to do it in a completely automated fashion. So in 2020, they've done a second proof of concept. And again, I'm blown away by this because in the middle of the world's worst public health crisis, still ongoing in the United States, the hospitals have made this a priority. In fact, one of the co-chairs of this particular working group is the CISO for one of the largest hospitals in New York City. And during the entire spring, when New York City was in the peak of crisis, this gentleman only missed 2 meetings, 2 weekly meetings. That's how much a priority this is for the healthcare sector. And they're really focusing on identifying what are the flaws in implementing this and how do we move forward. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those flaws, but the emphasis really is on showing that this can work in the world and that it's helpful for the defenders to defend their networks. So what are we focusing on? What are our next steps? And this is the work that we've done over the last 6 to 9 months. First is to make sure that we've got the model fully locked down from an architectural perspective. We're still sort of making sure that we've solved all of these whiteboard problems. We can do it locally, but if the vision is, as you talked about, making this machine readable and scalable across organizations, we need to sort of identify what happens when we try this. So I'm going to walk through some of these issues in just a moment, but I also want to focus on tooling. We're partnering with some companies, or some companies are participating from different parts of the tooling ecosystem. open source tools, commercial tools. We have a big tent of saying what tools exist today. And in fact, we have a list. We've built a taxonomy of SBOM tools. And we have a list of here are the tools that fit into this niche. And so if this is something that interests you and your company, we'd love to put you on this list and sort of show, hey, you do SBOM work, you speak one of these 3 formats that we talked about, that'd be lovely. Part of this process is also doing an analysis of what are the gaps, what are the tools that we need today, which is a great opportunity for those of you who are thinking about starting a new company to say, let's dive into this. And in fact, I just talked to the CEO of a small startup based in the United States that is exclusively focused on SBOM, which I think is kind of cool. We know a lot of companies are producing SBOMs today or helping their customers with SBOM data, but now there's a company that is explicitly and exclusively focused on SBOM. We've also pivoted to sort of getting the message out there. The mantra I have is that Allan doesn't scale. You know, it's my job to talk about SBOM and to help herd the cats, but the community, it comes best from the community. One of the fun things that folks are talking about is what's draft contract language look like? How can people ask for it today? And if you're not going to be able to get an entire SBOM from your supplier, what are some of the partial things so that you can start helping your supplier to climb that mountain and get ready? And of course, further demonstrations in other sectors. And so we're talking to folks in the energy sector and the finance sector, the automotive, the global automotive industry is interested in this. So there are a bunch of different approaches for it. And then finally, the meeting that we're going to be having on October 22nd, the big multi-stakeholder meeting, we're going to be presenting the first draft of a playbook. So how can a company that wants to produce an SBOM, what are the sets of decisions they have and what are the options they have? So very quickly, I'm going to walk through some of the challenges. First, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but it'd be very hard to map to a vulnerability database. Software naming is a known hard problem. Do you use com.sun.java or com.oracle.java? Well, they're the same piece of software, just depends when you started keeping your database. This is all well and good. The problem is, it's not that there isn't a standard for naming of software. The problem is there are multiple standards for naming software. And that means that we've got divergent approach. So the community has produced some guidance to help lead to convergence. We're not going to solve the problem, but we're going to help it. Similarly, how do we share SBOM data? How do we get it down the supply chain? How do we help it go from supplier to customer? There's not going to be a single solution, but the community has drafted some guidance and tied it into other efforts like the MUD protocol. The last challenge I want to flag is this idea that not all vulnerabilities actually put you and your customers at risk. And this is something that has been really important for folks, especially the big commercial tech providers, which is to say, hey, I want a way to communicate to my customers that yes, I'm using OpenSSL 0.9, but I'm only using the pseudo random number generator. And so at no point are you at risk for the Heartbleed vulnerability. So making sure as folks learn what's under the hood and can see that list of ingredients, helping them appreciate and allowing someone who's bold enough to say, yes, I've done the work and I can assure you you're not at risk is going to be really important. There's some great research opportunities. I'm happy to talk more about this. You know, understanding if my SBOM has 5,000 components, what are the 100 that are the most important? I think that's a great challenge for those of you who think about software execution, software binaries. Similarly, how can we automate surveillance of certain types of open source projects, right? So how do I detect whether or not someone's trying to backdoor an open source project? A lot of this can be done with fairly straightforward machine learning, but I don't know of anyone who's built this kind of system today. Similarly, proving non-exploitability is both a mathematical problem, but it's also going to be a fun policy challenge. Those of you who are in the policy world, legal world, I'd love you to start thinking about what does it mean? And how do we have some wiggle room so that a company can say, I'm not exploitable, but every so often they're going to be a little wrong as we learn more about a vulnerability. If we want to have companies be more forthright, what does that flexibility look like? And then finally, those who are in industry, think about asking for an SBOM. Think about partnering with some of your colleagues in industry to do a proof of concept exercise. To sum up, transparency is, to use an American marketing term, part of a complete security breakfast. We know that we need to do a lot to secure IoT, I'm arguing that SBOM is going to be critical to build on what we need. So there's been a lot of great work that's happened internationally. We've got a global community. We'd love for you to join. Here's how to get in touch with me. That's my email address. There's that webpage, nti.gov/SBOM, which has a lot of resources. Find me on Twitter. Use the hashtag SBOM. Find me the next time we have lucky enough to be in person, and I'll give you this SBOM sticker. You can't be a cool security project without a sticker. So I'll stop there, and we've just a little more time to have a discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Allan. Yeah, you're not physically here, but you brought in some sunlight into the studio. And we do have 4 more questions to round up with for the last 5 minutes. Luca Alodi, he says, having a software component may not automatically mean to be vulnerable. For example, because the vulnerable code cannot be reached in the product that embeds it. So to know whether you have a problem, just knowing that what's inside the box may not be sufficient. And further investigation may still be needed. Does SBOM account for this? And it also refers to the next comment, which I also mentioned to you then. From René Laan, he says, is this not going to give rise to a whole lot of false positives? Many vulnerabilities are only relevant in a specific use case. Please comment, Allan.
No, I agree completely. Those are great points, and that tags that last question where the community is actively trying to tackle this. Because there are lots of folks, I use the example of Heartbleed. There are between 600 and 1,000 different function calls you can make out of OpenSSL. 2 of them call the code that is Heartbleedable. So there is going to be lots of times where this is going to say there are vulnerabilities. Now, one perspective from customers said, still out-of-date code, and if you're shipping code that has a known vulnerability in this case, what does it say about the rest of your code? But I think from a risk management perspective, I like the term false positives, we should be highlighting what's useful. The community is still struggling to name what we're calling that, but it is this tension of exploitability that the community is actively working on today. We'd love your help. And I think there's gonna be a draft paper that's gonna be circulated for this October 22nd meeting that I've talked about. We'd love your feedback on it.
Okay, thank you, Allan. 2 more questions. One by Robert Herekop again. You already had a question from him before. It's just for verification. Understand I correct that the message is, let's demand an SBOM when obtaining IoT products? I guess the answer is yes, right?
Yes, start asking for SBOMs. We acknowledge that, right, again, this really applies primarily to organizations doing this kind of purchasing. I don't want to imply this is something that I expect everyone to be reading the back of a label in a store when you buy something. But I think this is going to be very useful in areas like healthcare, transportation, energy, building management, all of these areas where our entire lives are dependent on these devices.
Okay, so the last question is about trust, and it's from Bob van der Moezel. Does SBOM include the source of SBOM data? How to know one can trust the SBOM data itself? Allan.
This is a phenomenal question, and clearly asked by someone who's spent time in the security world, which is, how do we trust the trust, right? It's a whole chain there. There are a couple of ways of thinking about it. First is, we wanted to start the ball rolling with the keeping honest people honest approach, which is to say, we know that this is going to be a gradual adoption process, so let's start off by helping people understand that they need to collect it on the development side and start using it as the user side. So the question is, what's the source of the data and how do I trust the data hasn't been tampered? Well, from the tamper-proof approach, there are lots of different ways to guarantee integrity. I start off by saying, well, how do you trust the software? If the software itself isn't signed, all bets are off. If the software is signed, it has some integrity mechanism, let's just use that same integrity mechanism on the SBOM. Similarly, as I talked about the source of it, one of the things that we've built into the SBOM component data is what's the author, right? Did it come from the original author of this open source library way upstream, or did it come from the final good assembler? Or did it come from a consultant that came in once I put it on my network? There are lots of sources of this data, and we want to acknowledge that there's just going to be a lot of flexibility as we learn how to do this. This is an evolving process. We're learning about it together. This is going to represent a small revolution in how all software on the planet is made and sold. This shouldn't be done by a small group of people. We're really happy that it's been a big community that includes representatives from every different sector from countries around the world. And so I'm going to finish with just a plea to, if this interests you, if you'd like to get involved, if you have ideas, please reach out. I'm happy to schedule a briefing for you and your team and get you guys involved in some mailing lists and some building.